Hey Reddit, I've been lurking here for a while, but this seemed like the place to share a story I've never told anyone in full. It's been sitting with me for years, and every time I see an old violin or hear a jazz tune, it pulls me right back to the most chaotic chapter of my life. This was the 1920s, smack in the middle of Prohibition. My name's William, but everyone just called me Will. I was a violinist, not famous or anything, just one of those guys bouncing between orchestras and symphonies trying to make a living. Back then, being a musician wasn't glamorous. Sure, the Roaring Twenties had this dazzling exterior, flappers, jazz clubs, and moonshine, but for people like me, it was a grind. When this story starts, I was 25, broke, and touring with a second-rate symphony called the Americana Ensemble. We weren't exactly selling out concert halls, but we did all right in small-town theaters and fancy hotels where the wealthy could sip their cocktails behind closed doors. Kansas City, a night to forget. Our stop in Kansas City was like most others. We were booked for 2 nights at a grand, gilded theater called the Lyric. Ornate chandeliers hung like dripping gold from the ceiling, and red velvet covered every inch of the seats and curtains. Outside, the streets were alive with Model T Fords, streetcars, and the soft hum of illicit activity. After the first show, the conductor, Mr. Richard Harper, a wiry man with a penchant for bourbon and loud opinions, invited us to a private soiree. His cryptic grin should have been my first warning. Good pay, just a little extra work, he said, waving a cigar in the air. Turns out this extra work wasn't about music. When we arrived at the back room of a jazz club called the Blue Barrel, the real purpose of the meeting became clear. There, leaning casually against the bar, was a man I'd come to fear and respect in equal measure. Jimmy Two-Tone Harrison. He had the kind of slicked-back hair that glistened like oil and a silver tongue to match. His suit screamed money, and his eyes promised trouble. "Ah, you must be the fiddler," Jimmy said, flashing a toothy grin as he handed me a glass of whiskey. "You've got an interesting opportunity ahead of you." Opportunity, that's what they always call it before you're knee-deep in disaster, right? The deal. Jimmy laid it out plain. He needed someone with an unassuming face and a knack for slipping under the radar. People see a guy with a violin case, they don't think bootlegger, he explained, his voice smooth as jazz on a warm night. The job was simple, or so he said. I'd carry my violin case, loaded with bottles of top-shelf whiskey, and deliver it to specific spots along our tour route. The pay was generous, more than I made playing, and honestly, I was too broke to say no. The first run was supposed to be a piece of cake. A drop at a speakeasy in the basement of a Kansas City bakery. They called it the Dusty Loaf and ran it like clockwork. I'd walk in, pretend to browse for bread, and leave the case behind the counter. But nothing about that night went as planned. The first drop. When I stepped into the bakery, the warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread hit me like a memory of simpler times. The place was quiet except for the rhythmic thunk of a rolling pin on dough. Behind the counter stood a young woman, maybe 20, with chestnut curls and a nervous smile. Her name tag read Clara. "You're the, delivery?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, sliding the case onto the counter. "You're Clara." Before she could answer, the bell above the door jingled, and 2 men in dark suits stormed in. They weren't there for pastries. Federal agents, one barked, flashing a badge. My stomach dropped. Clara froze, her hands trembling as she tried to hide the case. But these guys weren't amateurs. They spotted it immediately. "What's in the case, pal?" the agent growled, stepping closer. Thinking fast, I forced a laugh. "My violin. I just finished a concert." The agent narrowed his eyes. "Open it." My heart raced as I unlatched the case, praying Jimmy hadn't done something stupid like pack it full. To my shock, it actually held my violin. Nothing else. "You'll forgive me if I don't serenade you," I quipped, trying to keep my voice steady. The agent sneered but backed off. Clara, however, looked like she was about to faint. I knew then that this wasn't over. A warning in shadows. When I got back to the Blue Barrel, Jimmy was waiting. His expression shifted from amused to icy when I told him about the feds. "Clara almost blew it," I said, my frustration bubbling over. Jimmy leaned back, lighting a cigarette. You'll learn, Will. This game isn't about trust. It's about leverage. People like Clara, they're scared for a reason. He didn't elaborate, but I didn't need him to. That night, as I played my violin on stage, the notes felt heavier, darker. The music was my escape, but now it was tangled in something I couldn't ignore. And that was just the beginning. All right, Reddit, back again. If Kansas City was the spark, Chicago was the bonfire. Things escalated fast, and looking back, I'm still amazed I got out of it alive. After our shaky Kansas City gig, the Americana Ensemble boarded a creaky train bound for Chicago. As the train rattled along, the city grew on the horizon like a storm cloud, gray, sprawling, and alive. Chicago in the 20s was the pulse of Prohibition. The speakeasies were bigger, the gangs meaner, and the stakes deadly. I sat in the last car, staring out at the endless blur of factories and smokestacks. The other musicians were buzzing about our next show, a ritzy performance at the Palmer House Hotel, but my mind was elsewhere. The deal with Jimmy had left a knot in my stomach. I couldn't stop replaying Clara's panicked face or the weight of the agent's glare. I should have backed out then. But, well, desperation's a persuasive devil. The Palmer House performance. The Palmer House was pure opulence. Marble floors, gilded staircases, and crystal chandeliers that seemed to drip from the heavens. Our performance was held in their grand ballroom, a cavernous space filled with the city's elite. Men in tailored suits, women in sequin dresses, the air thick with the scent of cigars and champagne. Bootleg, of course. I was tuning my violin backstage when Mr. Harper appeared. His usual swagger was replaced with a nervous edge. "Will," he said, pulling me aside, "Jimmy's got another job for you tonight." My chest tightened. "Another delivery?" He nodded. "This one's bigger. After the show, you're to meet a man named Samuel on the south side, near the old stockyards. He'll handle the rest." Something about the way Harper avoided my gaze told me this wasn't a simple drop. But before I could press him, the curtain call came. Music and shadows. On stage, I poured everything into the performance. Music had always been my sanctuary, a place where nothing else mattered. The crowd seemed to disappear as my bow danced across the strings. The world outside, the gangs, the smuggling, the danger, felt miles away. But as the final notes of our encore faded, reality came crashing back. Harper handed me a violin case as I stepped off stage. This one was heavier than usual, and I knew without opening it that it wasn't my instrument inside. "Don't be late," Harper muttered before disappearing into the crowd. The South Side Rendezvous. Chicago's South Side after dark was a world apart from the glitzy Palmer House. The streets were dimly lit, lined with warehouses and factories that loomed like silent sentinels. I followed Harper's instructions, taking a trolley to a deserted corner near the stockyards. There, under a flickering street lamp, stood Samuel. He was tall and broad, his overcoat straining against his frame. His face was hard to read in the shadows, but his voice carried a quiet authority. "You're late," he said, though I was right on time. I handed him the case, my palms sweating despite the cold night air. Samuel opened it just enough to peek inside, then nodded. "Follow me," he said, turning toward a nearby alley. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps behind me. I turned to see two figures emerging from the shadows. They weren't here to make friends. Federal agents. One of them barked, drawing a badge and a pistol. A narrow escape. My heart stopped. Samuel, however, didn't miss a beat. In one swift motion, he slammed the case shut and threw it to me. "Run!" he shouted, shoving me toward the alley. I didn't think, I just ran. The cold air burned my lungs as I sprinted through the maze of narrow alleys and back streets. Behind me, I could hear the agents shouting, their footsteps growing louder. Samuel stayed behind to buy me time. The last thing I saw was him raising his fists as the agents closed in. Somehow, I managed to lose them in the labyrinth of warehouses. I ducked into an abandoned building, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The case was still clutched in my hands, its contents a dangerous mystery. When the coast was clear, I slipped out and made my way back to the hotel. Jimmy's fury. The next morning, Jimmy showed up at the Palmer house unannounced. His polished demeanor was gone, replaced by a simmering rage. "Do you have any idea what you almost cost me?" he hissed, cornering me in the dressing room. I tried to explain, but he cut me off. "Samuel's in custody because of you. And that case, it had more than whiskey in it. You're lucky the feds didn't catch you, or you'd be rotting in a cell right now." I felt like a trapped animal, my mind racing for a way out. But before I could say anything, Jimmy's expression softened slightly. "You're not useless, Will," he said, his tone almost fatherly. "But you need to learn how to stay ahead of the game. Next time, don't run. Improvise. Next time." The words sent a chill down my spine. Hey Reddit, back with the next chapter of this wild ride. By now, the whole smuggling operation felt like a second life. One I hadn't signed up for but couldn't escape. The tour rolled on, taking us south to St. Louis, a city famous for its towering gateway arch, though it wasn't built yet, and its underground dealings. If Chicago was chaos, St. Louis was deception wrapped in charm. The city was quieter on the surface, but its speakeasies and riverfront warehouses were teeming with deals that would make the most hardened gangsters nervous. The Hotel Majestic. We were booked to stay and perform at the Hotel Majestic, a sprawling brick building with Art Deco flourishes and a lobby that smelled like polished wood and old money. The bellhops wore crisp uniforms, and every guest seemed to have secrets hidden behind their refined smiles. Our rooms were modest, but the ballroom where we performed was stunning. Ornate moldings framed the ceiling, and a massive chandelier sparkled with what I assumed were real crystals. The hotel staff treated us like royalty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they let on. After we settled in, Mr. Harper called for a meeting in his suite. The entire ensemble shuffled in, sipping the complimentary coffee that tasted like it had been brewed from yesterday's grounds. Harper didn't waste time. "We have another engagement after the show," he said, his voice low. Jimmy's orders. My stomach churned. I had barely escaped Chicago intact, and now this? The setup. The plan was simple in theory. After our performance, I was to carry a violin case, of course, to a riverboat docked along the Mississippi. The boat was hosting a private gambling party, a hotspot for gangsters, bootleggers, and anyone else with more money than sense. My job was to deliver the case to a man named Charles, or Charlie Red, as Jimmy called him. "He's a regular," Harper explained. "You'll know him by his red tie and a scar on his cheek." The rest of the ensemble gave me sympathetic looks, but no one offered to switch places. They all knew better than to cross Jimmy. The riverboat. After the show, I slipped out of the hotel with the case in hand. The streets were alive with jazz music pouring from hidden clubs and the faint clinking of glasses behind closed doors. When I reached the docks, the riverboat was impossible to miss. The Golden Bell was lit up like a carnival, its paddle wheel churning slowly in the dark water. A jazz band played on the upper deck, and the laughter of wealthy partygoers spilled over the railings. I boarded cautiously, nodding at the bouncer, a hulking man with a permanent scowl, and made my way to the lower level, where the private games were held. The room was a smoky den of activity. Men in tailored suits and women in glittering dresses sat around felt-covered tables, their faces half-lit by the glow of hanging lanterns. I spotted Charlie Red near the far wall, his scar unmistakable. A dangerous game. When I approached Charlie, he greeted me with a sly grin. "You must be Jimmy's boy," he said, taking the case. "Sit down. Have a drink." I hesitated, but refusing didn't seem like a good idea. I took a seat at the poker table and was immediately handed a glass of whiskey. Charlie opened the case under the table, nodding in approval before sliding it to a man beside him. The tension in my chest loosened slightly until Charlie spoke again. "Stick around, Will. You might learn something." The next hour was a blur of cards, laughter, and coded conversations that I couldn't quite follow. It became clear that this wasn't just a gambling party. It was a meeting of powerful men who controlled the city's underworld. But then, things took a turn. The raid. Just as Charlie was dealing a new hand, the doors burst open. Uniformed officers flooded the room, shouting orders and brandishing weapons. The music on the upper deck screeched to a halt as chaos erupted. "Everyone stay where you are," an officer bellowed. My instinct was to run, but Charlie grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "You don't move," he hissed. "Not until I say so." I froze, heart pounding as officers swept through the room, checking faces and confiscating contraband. One of them stopped in front of Charlie, his eyes narrowing. "You're under arrest," the officer said, pulling out handcuffs. Charlie's expression didn't falter. "You've got the wrong guy," he said smoothly, but the officer wasn't buying it. That's when Charlie turned to me, his voice low but urgent. "Take this." He slipped something into my pocket, a small leather-bound notebook. "Get it to Jimmy." Before I could respond, he stood up, raising his hands as the officers led him away. Escape on the river. In the chaos, no one seemed to notice me slip out. My hands shook as I felt the notebook in my pocket, its edges sharp against my skin. I didn't know what it contained, but if Charlie wanted Jimmy to have it, it had to be important and dangerous. I made it back to the hotel just before dawn, my mind racing. When I handed the notebook to Jimmy later that day, his face darkened as he flipped through its pages. "This changes everything," he muttered, but he didn't elaborate, and just like that, I was pulled deeper into the web. Hey Reddit, I'm back to continue the story. By the time we hit Memphis, I'd learned two things. The smuggling world was more dangerous than I ever imagined, and once you were in, getting out wasn't an option. If St. Louis was a quiet con, Memphis was a wild song. The city was alive with blues spilling out of Beale Street, riverboats drifting lazily down the Mississippi, and the faint scent of barbecue wafting through the humid air. It was beautiful, sure, but beneath that charm was a city on edge. The notebook Charlie had given me was burning a hole in my memory. Jimmy hadn't told me what was inside, but whatever it was, it had clearly shaken him. The Cotton Club connection. Our Memphis performance was booked at a high-end club modeled after the famous Cotton Club in Harlem. The stage was framed by electric lights, and the tables were packed with the kind of people who could afford to ignore Prohibition altogether. The audience was a mix of local elites and out-of-towners, all eager to soak in the music and sip their smuggled cocktails. After our set, Jimmy appeared in the wings like a ghost. He always had a way of slipping in unnoticed, his polished shoes silent on the hardwood floor. "Will, we need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He led me to a private booth in the club's back room. The air was thick with cigar smoke, and the muffled sounds of jazz created a strange, almost surreal backdrop. Jimmy pulled the leather notebook from his pocket and placed it on the table between us. "This," he said, tapping the cover, "is a map of connections, names, deals, routes. It's the lifeblood of the operation." I stared at it, the weight of its significance sinking in. "Why give it to me?" "Because," Jimmy said, leaning closer, "there's a mole in the network. Someone's been feeding information to the feds. And if this falls into the wrong hands, we're all finished." A hidden partner. My new task wasn't just another drop. Jimmy wanted me to take the notebook to a contact named Evelyn. "She's trustworthy," he assured me, though his expression suggested otherwise. Evelyn ran a small dance hall on the edge of town, a place that doubled as a speakeasy for those in the know. When I arrived, the sound of a lively band greeted me, and the dance floor was packed with couples swaying to the rhythm. Evelyn was behind the bar, a striking woman in her early 30s with sharp features and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her red dress shimmered under the dim lights, and her voice carried the confidence of someone who'd seen it all. "You must be the fiddler," she said, her lips curving into a sly smile. "Jimmy said you'd come." I handed her the notebook, expecting a quick exchange. Instead, she flipped it open, scanning the pages with a furrowed brow. "This is worse than I thought," she muttered, her tone losing its lightness. "Jimmy didn't tell you everything, did he?" A change of plans. Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed from the entrance. The room fell silent as a group of armed men stormed in. They weren't law enforcement, these guys were muscle, and they were looking for something, or someone. Evelyn didn't flinch. She snapped the notebook shut and shoved it into my hands. "Go out the back. Now." "What about you?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "I'll handle this," she said, already stepping out from behind the bar to confront the intruders. I didn't stick around to argue. Clutching the notebook, I slipped through the back door into an alley. The sound of shouting and breaking glass followed me as I ran. A chase through Memphis. The alley emptied onto Beale Street, which was still buzzing with life despite the late hour. I tried to blend into the crowd, but it wasn't long before I spotted one of the thugs weaving through the sea of people. His eyes locked on me. My heart pounded as I ducked into a side street, the narrow space barely wide enough to squeeze through. The darkness closed in, and I stumbled over loose cobblestones, the distant sound of footsteps growing louder. I finally emerged onto a quieter street, where an old man sat on a stoop strumming a guitar. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in my disheveled state. "Trouble, son?" he asked, his voice slow and steady. "Something like that," I muttered, glancing over my shoulder. Without a word, the man nodded toward a nearby door. Inside, quickly, a safe haven. The door led to a small, dimly lit room filled with musical instruments, guitars, banjos, fiddles, all stacked haphazardly against the walls. The old man followed me in, locking the door behind us. "Name's Clarence," he said, settling into a worn armchair. "Don't worry, no one will find you here." For the first time that night, I allowed myself to breathe. As I sat there, clutching the notebook, I couldn't help but wonder who I could trust anymore. Clarence must have sensed my unease. He picked up a fiddle from the pile and handed it to me. "Play something," he said. "Might calm your nerves." I hesitated but eventually gave in. The familiar feel of the strings under my fingers was a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. The music filled the small room, drowning out the chaos of the night. When I finished, Clarence smiled. "You've got soul, kid. Don't let them take it from you." Hey Reddit, it's time for the conclusion. By the time we left Memphis, I realized this wasn't just a smuggling gig anymore. It was a high-stakes battle, and I was smack in the middle of it. Little did I know, the end of the tour would bring everything crashing down. A final destination. The Americana Ensemble's last stop was New Orleans, a city dripping with life and secrets. The French Quarter felt like a living, breathing thing, with its gas lamps, wrought iron balconies, and cobblestone streets. Music poured out of every corner. Jazz bands, street performers, and impromptu parades that seemed to materialize out of thin air. Our show was at the Dauphine Opera House, a grand, centuries-old venue with peeling paint that only added to its charm. The moment we arrived, Jimmy pulled me aside, his usual slick demeanor replaced by something graver. "We're meeting tonight. Big players, high stakes," he said, his voice low. "You'll be there, too." I opened my mouth to protest, but Jimmy silenced me with a look. "Don't forget, kid, you're part of this now." The meeting at the bayou. That night, Jimmy drove me out to a secluded spot on the edge of the bayou. The place was eerie, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for non-existent sounds. A weathered boathouse stood at the water's edge, its slanted roof barely holding together. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Around the table sat 5 men, each more intimidating than the last. Evelyn was there, too, her sharp eyes cutting through the room like a blade. Jimmy placed the leather notebook on the table, and the room fell silent. "This," he said, gesturing to it, "is our entire operation, and thanks to Will here, it didn't fall into the wrong hands." I wanted to correct him, that it was Evelyn who had saved it, but I stayed quiet. The men began poring over the notebook, discussing routes and risks in hushed tones. But then the door burst open. The betrayal. It was Harper. His face was pale, his hands raised as 2 federal agents flanked him. The room erupted into chaos. "I had no choice," Harper shouted as the agents ordered everyone to freeze. "They knew everything." Jimmy's face darkened, his calm mask cracking for the first time. "You spineless." Before he could finish, the agents turned their guns on us. "You're all under arrest," one barked. In the chaos, Evelyn leaned toward me. "Stay close," she whispered. The great escape. What happened next was a blur. Evelyn knocked over the table, scattering papers and throwing the room into disarray. Jimmy lunged for the agents, giving us precious seconds to bolt. "Run!" Evelyn shouted, dragging me toward the back door. We burst out into the humid night, the sounds of shouting and gunfire behind us. Evelyn led me to a waiting skiff tied to the dock. "Get in!" she yelled, untying the rope with quick, practiced hands. As we pushed off into the bayou, the boathouse erupted in flames, a desperate move by Jimmy to destroy the evidence. The fire painted the water orange, the smoke curling into the sky like a signal to anyone watching. A new beginning. We paddled for hours, the swamp swallowing us whole. Eventually, we reached a hidden shack deep in the bayou. Inside was a stash of cash, fake IDs, and weapons. Evelyn's escape plan, it seemed. "You've got a choice, Will," she said as we sat by the fire. "You can keep running or you can start over. But either way, the life you had is gone." Her words hit hard. For the first time, I truly understood what I had lost. Music had been my world, but now it was tangled up in something darker. The final note. Evelyn helped me disappear. I traded my violin for a new identity and left the smuggling world behind. But some nights, when the air is thick and the world feels still, I take out my old violin. The music comes hesitantly at first, but then it flows, carrying memories of speakeasies, smoky rooms, and the life I almost didn't escape. Maybe one day I'll go back to performing. Or maybe this is where my symphony ends. Thanks for reading, Reddit. Feels good to finally get this off my chest. If you've made it this far, I hope you enjoyed the ride.